They've really done it. They've screwed up the housing market so badly that society's starting to unravel before our very eyes. Years and years of ignoring housing affordability as it kept getting worse and worse is now having shocking and devastating consequences. Countries like Australia and Canada have gotten so bad that hardworking citizens are being pushed towards poverty and some are being kicked out onto the streets. People have had enough. Will the destruction of housing affordability lead to civil unrest and the full breakdown of society? I'm Biko Konstantinos, and that's what we're going to talk about today. ChatGPT doesn't know who I am, saying that I'm not widely known. That's correct. Or that I gained prominence after their last update. I bloody wish so. But you can get to know me by subscribing to my channel. I'll provide you with a lot of information about the housing market from an analytical and independent point of view. And let's face it, the cost of housing affects everyone. And very sadly, it's negatively affecting more and more people. To the point now where many people are reaching breaking point. The amount of frustration and disillusionment is really starting to ramp up.
Canada's falling apart at like a rapid, alarming pace.
In 2 days, I'm moving out of this damn city.
I gotta be honest, Canada is so disappointing now. It's a completely different place.
Desperate refugees who've come to Canada looking for a safe haven are now living on the streets.
I want to know how the hell people in Canada are even living.
Let's keep watching and consider the emotions from those who are being affected.
Just so frustrating that like you do all the right things, you go to university and then you come out, you get a job, whatever, and you can barely afford rent.
You go to school, you get a degree, and you're still not guaranteed a job. $60K a year? That used to be like a decent amount of money, not anymore.
I don't understand how I make $34 an hour and I can't function. I can't pay my bills. I can't even literally keep gas in my car to get to work 3 days a week.
I have this friend, he's like a software developer. He makes a decent amount of money, maybe like close to 150. There's no chance I can get a house unless my parents help me. And I was just like, man, like a software developer making like 150, and he's like, man, I can't get a house.
This is it, the destruction of the middle class. When hardworking Canadians and Australians go to uni, work at full-time jobs, and still struggle to afford their costs of living, you've got a massive problem. Imagine busting your butt working 40 to 60 hours per week and still struggling just to pay your bills every single month. You'd start asking yourself, what the heck are you actually working for? And that's why we're starting to see this huge swell of emotions, but it wouldn't take long for people to really start getting angry and pushing back.
People who have full-time jobs making like 40K who are going to the food bank.
I can't afford to move out. I'm 24, and I'm embarrassed that I can't move out. I can't leave my toxic household.
How do you live?
I can't function anymore.
It's brutal out there.
I feel so utterly stuck. I don't know what to do anymore.
This Canadian dream, is it still a thing?
The great Canadian and Australian dream of owning your own home. And guess what? This was a dream available to everyone just 30 to 40 years ago. In the 1980s and 90s, housing was extremely affordable when the average house was only 3 times the average income. Just think about how affordable that was. And that's why a family with kids could buy a house and pay it off even though they only had one income earner. Fast forward to today, and it's now harder for a double income family than it was for a single income family just 30 years ago. So you've got the added pressure of everyone having to work, but you've got way larger mortgages compared to incomes, which means it's way harder to buy a house. But if you can, it'll be way more difficult to pay it off over a much longer period than previous generations had to. Like I've mentioned in previous videos, the housing crisis is years in the making. You see, when wages, represented by this black line, grow around the same amount as house prices, then housing affordability remains the same. But as soon as house prices start outperforming wages, housing affordability deteriorates exponentially, because it means that housing is getting more and more expensive for every future generation that buys into the market. And that's because the gap between house prices and wages is growing wider and wider. And the Australian housing market shows a very similar pattern, because from the late 1990s, early 2000s, then the gap between house prices and and wages really ramped up. So both Canada and Australia had some of the most unaffordable housing markets in the world prior to COVID. But then what happened? Every country went on a massive stimulus and government intervention program, and this artificially inflated house prices up to 30 to 40% just in a couple of years, but at the same time created ultra high inflation, which raised the cost of living astronomically, and it then flowed into the rental market, which is why we've seen unprecedented vacancy levels and ridiculous surging rents. So contrary to what people might think, not everyone has been negatively affected by these policies. In fact, many people have won the equivalent of the lotto. You see, if you own property, every one of those properties that you own have risen 30 to 40%. And if you don't have any mortgage, or your mortgage levels are quite low, you're not really affected by the surging interest rates. So pandemic policies have created massive winners and massive losers, because if you don't own a property, very sadly, you're one of those losers. And this is why we're starting to see a lot of resentment build in countries like Canada and Australia.
So you can't afford a house, so then you need to rent. And the rental prices are so beyond astronomical because you're paying for someone's mortgage, and someone who perhaps has multiple properties, and you know you'll never get in, and you also don't have any security, so you can be kicked out at any moment. And these rental increases are just suffocating, and they're not indexed on how much more we're earning. So there is an enormous amount of resentment, I think.
Renters really have been royally screwed in the last few years. And I do understand that mortgage repayments have risen dramatically due to surging interest rates. But if someone had a property prior to the pandemic, they've still achieved a record capital gain in a short few years. You see, house prices have risen so fast, they've basically traded like a penny stock on the stock market. And if you make a 40% gain on an $800,000 home, that's $320,000 of capital gains. Now, where else could you make a gain like that? And also with extremely limited risk, because government policies help prop up the housing market. So renters, on the other hand, have made no capital gains, are finding it harder and harder to pay their rents, and are being locked out of the housing market due to surging prices.
It now takes 25 years for the average Toronto family to save up for a down payment. The average rent has gone from $950 to over $2,000. Housing costs in Canada are 45 to 75% more expensive than in the United States.
So trying to save up to buy a home now can be near impossible, and that's made even worse by surging rents. So unless people are supported by their parents or receive a large inheritance, they could be locked out of the housing market forever. But what's really causing anger and frustration out there is that properties are basically making more money than the average wage every single year. So of course non-property owners are going to be pissed, because they might be slaving their guts out and then they pay tax on every cent they earn, while property owners are making more than their wage just for holding the property, and they get ultra generous tax deductions at the same time. And that's how you end up with a massive wealth divide, where wealth isn't decided by how hard you study and how hard you work, it's decided by how much property your family owns. So we actually seem to be going back to the class system seen centuries ago, where you had the property owners and then you had the peasants and nothing much in between. So look how much wealth now is in the hands of baby boomers. And then you have Gen Xers, who are mostly able to buy property when it was still not too expensive. But look down here at millennials and how much wealth they currently have. People don't mind when they see other people get wealthy, but it's the inequality of opportunity that's the real problem. Someone who isn't going to inherit property from their parents should still have a good opportunity to be able to work and buy their own home. But if that opportunity is taken away, people are going to reach breaking point and something's going to crack. So government and central bank policy in countries like Canada and Australia have basically destroyed the entire housing market. And then they tell us we have a massive housing supply problem and the only solution is to build way more houses. But there's two major problems here. Developers are never going to flood the market with way too many houses, as as that could greatly risk the amount of profit they're able to make. And second, Canada and Australia have opened the immigration floodgates so wide that no development will be able to keep up with that extra demand. I mean, check out the population growth in Canada. If they really wanted to start improving housing affordability and look after their citizens who are now currently on the brink, all they'll need to do is greatly reduce these immigration levels so that the current housing development can meet the additional immigration supply coming in. We're in the middle of a crisis, there's a simple solution, so why aren't they doing it? Because they don't really want to solve the crisis. If you want to see how contradicting government policies can be, check out this simplistic graphic. Houses are too expensive? Tell people we need to increase housing supply. Isn't that what we're seeing now? Import more immigrants to build houses, but houses don't get built. Immigrants need to live somewhere, so house prices go up and they become way more expensive. Bloody great.
To young Canadians, I want to say something.
You're screwed. And not just young Canadians or young Australians, anyone in those countries who doesn't own a home is basically now being pushed towards poverty. And because of the obscene wealth divide that's been created due to government policies artificially inflating property demand, we're now headed towards massive upheaval in society, which could soon reach a tipping point and lead to civil unrest that could bring down the fabric of entire countries. I'm Biko Konstantinos.